This is chapter 7 from KAIA's perspective. I was 7 years old. Martai had been alive for a couple of weeks. Dad had left earlier that morning to work with the other men. Mum had given us breakfast as usual, but when the horse and rider came, she dropped everything and took a small backpack and left the hut. The women and children watched my mum jump onto the back of the horse. They watched me watching Mum with tiny Martai in my arms. Mum didn't look back at us, not once, as the horse trotted away down the path. We all followed behind. The other children thought it was a game. I hoped it might have been at first, but my mum didn't play games. A carriage waited on the other side of the northern bridge, and Mum clambered in. "Where is she going?" I'd asked Ata's partner Marama as she walked up beside me and put her arm around my shoulders. Her belly was round and growing her first baby. Her skin glowed. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "She's leaving, KAIA. She won't be back." At the time, I hadn't understood the words. I hadn't understood why she would say something like that. Everyone was staring at me. Marama had reached out to try and take Martai from me, but I pulled him away and ran back to our hut. I pushed a chair against the door and sat at the table. People came to the hut, peeping in the windows, knocking on the door. I pulled the curtains across and took Martai to the back of the hut. I curled up on my bed, gently rocking him in my arms. He'd slept for most of the morning, but when he'd woken up, he'd started to cry and wouldn't stop. I wrapped him in one of his blankets and put him on his brand new sleeping mat, woven by some of the women in the village to celebrate his birth. He fell asleep. I wanted to cry with relief or with exhaustion, but I couldn't make the tears come. When the end of day horn boomed out, I scooped Martai into my arms again and ran out onto the deck to wait for Dad. I watched him walk down the path with the other men. I watched the women coming out of their huts to whisper to him. By the time he'd reached our hut, I knew he'd found out Mum was gone. He walked up the stairs and straight past me and pulled the curtain closed in front of where his and Mum's sleeping mat was. He didn't come out for 3 days. I fed Martai fruit juice off a spoon. I cleaned him. I looked after him as well as I could. I barely slept. I didn't go to the learning hut. When Dad finally came out, he wouldn't look at me or talk to me. Dad was never the same again. Neither was I. Dad didn't go back to work with the other men after Mum left. He spent his days out the back of our hut with samples of leaves and plants. He used a piece of magnifying glass he had borrowed from Tinuku to look at them closely. He got lost in a world of plants and forgot about me and Martai. I got good at caring for my baby brother. I didn't have a choice. But as much as I loved Martai and I wanted to keep him safe, my stomach would twist as I watched the other children laughing and playing while I was hanging out the washing to dry on the railing. Marama offered to take Martai during the day so I could go back to the learning hut. But I didn't want anyone else to look after him. I had to do it. One day, Dad had come into the hut and looked at me where I sat at the table eating the dinner I'd made for myself. "Your mum is dead," he said. I didn't understand at first. I asked him how he knew. He said someone from Rindle had ridden over to tell him. Then I asked how it had happened, when she'd died, if she was really gone. He hadn't answered any of those questions. All he'd said was, "She's not coming back." So I tried to forget about her and move on. But my heart ached, and even though she had not always been a kind mum, she had been part of my life. But I'd always wondered, always wanted to know, what had really happened. My stomach twisted with guilt as I prepared to leave Martai behind. Even though I wouldn't admit it to anyone, I'd always known Marama would look after Martai. I hoped that if something happened to me, she would give him the truth, that even if I didn't make it, he knew that I had always planned to come back. I snuck out onto the deck and closed the door, waiting to make sure he hadn't followed me. When I turned around, I jumped at the sight of a figure behind me. Utter was leaning on the railing, looking over at me. He gripped a hatchet in his hand. He was ready for a battle, whatever that might have meant. Marama stood on their deck, next door, watching Utter nervously. If she didn't want him to go, she didn't say anything in front of me. "She'll watch over him," Utter said, smiling at Marama. I lifted my satchel onto my shoulder and walked down the stairs and down the path without looking back. "Take care, KAIA," Marama called. As soon as Utter and I left the slatted wooden pathways of our village, my feet squelched into the mud and my boots were coated in brown and green gunk. It had been a while since I'd had any reason to venture out of our village. As a child, I'd run and played on the outskirts of the deeper forest, so it had become an extension of our village. The mums liked us to stay close to the village so we could hear them call us for dinner, but there had been no danger then to make them need to keep us close. It felt like that was all about to change now. The forest began to feel like a stranger, someone I would have to get to know, who held hidden dangers that I would have to find out. We pushed through the bushes, dew and raindrops from the day before still dripping off leaves and onto my exposed skin. Anything that couldn't be pushed out of the way, Utter slashed through with his hatchet. I didn't want him with me, but his hatchet was making this go a lot faster. The quicker we found Dad, the quicker I could get back to Matai. We were both on high alert. What made it worse was we didn't know what we were watching out for. Kapa had been poisoned, but by what? Did Utter know and he was trying to keep it from me? Is that why he wanted to come with me? It made everything a threat, from the trees and plants to the birds all around. The blue, red and yellow parrots and toucans cawed and dipped around us. The carnaby birds zoomed over the treetops. It was a comfort to see their huge white wings beating the air, the souls of our people watching over us, like they had back on our homeland. They couldn't be the problem. They were sacred, and they weren't just from Durna. Like us, they'd lived on other isles, like Hapai, the original home of the Sundanas. The forest grew lighter and Utter slowed his pace as the bushes grew denser and harder to slash through. He stopped and turned to me. "Will you greet the sun with me?" he asked. I looked up and couldn't see the sun, but I knew she was there watching, because the day was beginning to warm. I nodded. Kneeling in the mud beside Utter, I closed my eyes. The sounds of the forest filled me, and I tried to find the right words to say. I needed as much strength as I could get, but all I could say was, "Please watch over me." After a short while, Utter cleared his throat, and I opened my eyes. I would have to remember to keep greeting and farewelling the sun, no matter how hard things got in here. It was the only thing to tie me to the people I'd left behind. Standing slowly, we looked around. "We've gone far enough. Let's scout the edges," Utter instructed. I instantly shook my head. "They would have found him if he was at the edges. I'm going further in." I trudged past him and continued through the bushes. "KAIA, it's too dangerous in there." I only stopped to argue my point. "How do you know? We haven't even tried. And I haven't seen anything wrong yet." "You've seen what happened to Kapa, haven't you?" "You can turn back then. I'll be fine on my own." I continued on, ducking and sliding between huge, thick leaves and tight gaps between palm trunks. It hardly took a second before Utter appeared back at my side. He wasn't going to leave me, which all at once was annoying and a relief. I couldn't tell him, but I was scared of what we might find ahead. We plunged on, but even Utter struggled through some thicker areas of growth. Hardly any light could get through the trees, and there had been so much rainfall that the ground had to take what the leaves couldn't hold. Some areas of land fully gave way beneath us as we trudged along, pools of water filling our footprints. The water felt like the tub on our back porch after the fire beneath it had been warming it up all day. But this water wasn't like the rainwater that we collected from the roof my father had made. This water was sickly green, a mix of algae and slimy leaves. There were more ponds dotted around us too, and they became murkier, the fish that darted around in them uglier and fatter, no doubt feasting on anything that fell in, and the lily pads were far more sparse. The day was heating up, and it felt like each spare piece of air around me had absorbed the sun's warmth to heat me up. I was sweating all over, my face dripped in streams from my forehead and off my chin. My hair stuck to my neck and shoulders. Each coil weighed me down with moisture and warmth. Ata managed to pull himself back in front of me when I paused to swish my hair off my neck and into a ponytail. We must have been walking most of the day without any sign of danger when I heard a noise. I knew I hadn't made it up. "What was that?" I whispered. Ata must have heard it too. He held his hatchet up with one hand and put his finger to his lips. We stood dead still, sweat dripping off us, listening. That's when the noise came again, a low, eerie whining. It sounded like an animal, or a human. Dad? It must have been Dad. Ignoring Ata's request for silence, I rushed forward, straight past him towards the noise. I tore through the leaves and bushes, listening out for the sound. I nearly tripped over something on the ground, but when I looked down, it wasn't a tree root or a fallen frond like I had expected. It was a human body with the deep brown skin of a Sundana. They were face down in the mud, but somehow making the noise we'd heard. Ata crashed through the bushes behind me, and he had to hold me back as I tried to dive towards the body. I had to know if it was Dad. "Let me look," I cried. Only when I stopped squirming in his arms did he let go of me. My knees squelched into the mud as I knelt beside the body. I pulled at the shoulders of the body and turned them over. The kanuku birds high above me must have been watching over him, because somehow there was still life in him. I held his head up and swiped the mud from his lips and eyes. Ata bent down beside me and we stared at him. I hadn't found my dad, but this was a Sundana boy I knew well. "Tawera?" I said in disbelief. I cleared mud off his face and neck, and my breath caught in my mouth when my fingers skirted across an open wound that ran from under his chin to his collarbone. Bloody, torn flesh hung around the tear marks, and the exposed inner part pulsed like it had its own life. It was as if something had torn his skin apart, but I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else that had done the damage. Whatever it was poisoning him. Was it the same as what had gotten Kappa? Ata scanned the surrounding trees and inspected the nearby bushes, but everything was still. Whatever had done this was gone, or at least hiding. Maybe it was in plain sight, and because the Sundanas trusted the forest, we couldn't see the danger right in front of us. Ata helped me turn Tawera over properly, both of us in shock as we tried in vain to get him to wake up. The only sign that he was still alive were his shaky breaths and the strange whining that escaped from his lips. "Do you have anything you can give him, KAIA?" Ata asked quietly. It sounded like he didn't think there was much hope, but I did have something. The single vial of turo juice Tinuku had given me. I pulled the strap of my satchel closer to my body and didn't say anything. What if I did give Tawera the turo juice and he died anyway? What if we found my dad and he needed it too? I couldn't bear it if we found my dad in the same condition and didn't have anything left to save him. But I thought of Tawera's family. Their hut was in the same row as us. I saw his mum most days. I watched his dad leave for the fields. If I were them, I'd want to know that someone had tried to help their boy, even if there hadn't been much hope. Ata's eyes burned into me as I decided what to do. There was only one thing that I could do. I reached into my satchel and pulled out a vial of turo juice. There was no clear skin to drop the liquid onto, so I sloshed some water from my bottle over the wound until I could see the skin properly. I gagged at the sight of his wound, turning my head away. I let the juice drop onto his open flesh. I snuck a look back at the wound, and it didn't look like anything had happened. The effect was usually instant. Even on a wound like this, there should have been some visible improvement. The wound was too far gone, and looking at Ata, he knew it too. "I thought he'd been scouted to Rindle," Ata said, confusion fighting with his sorrow for the boy. I shared the same feeling. Tawera shouldn't have been in the forest. What had happened for him to end up here? He was only a year or so older than me, and some would say the smartest in our whole village. He spent his days studying leaves and fish, when the other boys climbed trees and swam in the ponds. A Rindle scout had come to our village a few weeks ago, a fat white man in a stiff suit that had stepped into the learning hut, watching us like cattle in a barn. The scout had observed Tawera and pulled him aside. It was announced later that day that Tawera would be moving to Rindle. They would enroll him at the learning hut there, the school, the scout had called it. When someone from our village was selected by a member of the Royal Council to move to the Western Village, there were mixed feelings among the Sundanas. Some were proud. It meant that even the people of Rindle could see the potential of a Sundana. But most others were confused and angry. Why did the Rindles treat the Sundanas like we didn't exist, then come along and take one of us to live with them? I shared the same feeling. It didn't make any sense. When the day had come for Tawera to leave, everyone had gathered around the horse that led him out of the village to where the carriage waited for him. His family had been crying. So had he. It made me think of my mum. These were the same people that had taken my mum away from me. We all watched him get into the carriage. We saw it leave with him inside. It made seeing him here, close to death on the forest floor, even more of a shock. Why was he here and not in Rindle? A crack like a snapping bone came from above us. A swishing sound like the wings of a bird followed. I only had time to flick my eyes up and throw myself out of the way as a huge palm leaf hurtled towards the ground. Utter dove the other way and pulled Tawera with him. "Are you all right?" Utter called to me. I nodded. Branches and fronds fell all the time. It was only natural. The huge frond lay right where we had been kneeling. But then the cracking came from everywhere around us. And when I looked up, it was like the sky was falling. Thousands of snapping branches rang out like the crackling of a fire at its strongest, and fronds fell from every giant palm and crashed through the other bushes towards us. I covered my head as one tumbled towards me, narrowly missing me as I dove away. "Run!" Utter screamed. I threw myself forward and scurried on my hands and knees into the cover of some bushes. The palm fronds fell all around me, weighing down the thin layer of growth over my head. It sounded like a thunderstorm rolling in from the ocean. There was nothing to do but shrink as small as I could and wait for it to be over. And all at once, it was over. Silence. I peeled my hands off my head and peeked out of the bushes. The ground was covered in hundreds of fronds, creating a smooth carpet of green. All of that happened in the space of less than a minute. "Utter," I called from my hiding spot. When I didn't get a reply, my heart raced faster. Had one of them hit him? Had he been sliced in half by one of the frond's razor-sharp edges? The snapping started again, and I looked up in horror as more fronds fell to the ground. I couldn't stay here and wait to die. Darting out of my hiding place, all I could think about was getting myself as far from the giant palms as possible. Something hit me from the side, and I couldn't have been more grateful to feel Utter's arm around me as he pulled me away with him. Tawera was slung over his shoulder, flapping around as we ran. We found a small rock cave and dove inside. The falling leaves were following us, and now they were crashing down right in front of the entrance to the cave. Then it was silent again. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I'd hoped it was over for good this time. I looked down at my arm and saw it was bleeding where I must have been hit. It stung, and as I wiped the blood on the leg of my trousers, a wave of fear washed over me as I panicked I'd been poisoned. But the source of the poison couldn't be the palms, could it? I didn't think so. But I'd never seen a tree behave like that. I dropped the last few drops of churro onto the wound to stop anything before it could start. I peeked out at the trees. They were quiet and still, only a gentle breeze swaying the fronds. It reminded me of when I'd brushed my hair and I'd looked down at my brush to see hundreds of thick, curly strands, but when I looked in the mirror, my head was as full of hair as ever. These trees had dropped hundreds of fronds, but there were hundreds more ready to drop at any moment. It was like an endless supply of potential deaths hanging above us in the trees. If my dad was out there, he might not have found somewhere to hide. It made me even more certain that we had to find him. "We have to get out of here," I said, standing and marching towards the cave entrance. "Please sit for a moment," Utter said, breathing heavily. Tawera was draped over his lap, looking just as sick as before. "I'm not waiting here forever," I shouted as I continued to walk away. "Stop, KAIA," Ata growled, his voice echoing off the rounded cave walls. I'd never heard him use a voice like that. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were wide. "We could have been killed by those trees. I've never seen anything like this. We can't walk out there without a plan." "My dad is out there," I said impatiently. "The fact that we've nearly been killed makes it even more important we find him. Now." Ata gave me a pitying frown, like I was a child incapable of making good choices. I knew a lot more about making choices than he would ever understand. "This changes things. You must see that. We've seen the danger now, and that could only be a part of it. We still don't know the source of the poison. We've got Tawera to think of now." I looked down at Tawera. He had stopped making that whining noise and lay in Ata's arms, shivering despite the heat. "KAIA, I think it's time to realize we may not find your dad alive. I know you don't want to hear it, but this is bad. We have to get ourselves and Tawera out of the forest." I wanted to believe that my dad was out here. I pictured him sitting in a cave like this one we hid in, alive and well. But it was true that it might already be too late for him. What if he had already been injured or poisoned, and an attack, or whatever it was, had happened right on top of him? He could be dead on the ground. We could have run straight past him. I slumped down next to them on the ground and leaned against the cave wall. "What do you suggest then?" I asked. Ata raised his eyebrows at me, almost in surprise that I'd given in. But it wasn't giving in. I wouldn't give up on finding Dad, but we had to do something for Tawera, while there was still a chance of life for him. When Ata didn't answer my question, I blew a breath out my nose. "If you don't decide what we're going to do, I will." All right, he said hastily. "Let's discuss this." His eyes moved to Tawera. "That attack has driven us across the Isle. Right now, I believe we're closer to Rindle. We need to get Tawera help as soon as possible, before it's too late for him." Ata stared at me for a long moment, eyebrows raised. Was he really suggesting what it sounded like he was? "We're not going to Rindle," I shouted. I couldn't believe that he would consider it. The trip back to our village would take hours that Tawera may not have. If we could take him straight to Rindle, but they hate us. They won't even let us in the village. "He will die if we don't try." If we were as close to Rindle as Ata thought we were, we'd travelled nearly the entire width of the Isle. We couldn't go back through the forest with Tawera like this. Ata could carry him, but if there was another attack, it would slow us down again. If we wanted to get back to our village safely, we'd have to take the loop road, but that would take far too long, and we could be stopped and asked what we're doing wandering so far from our home. The only way Tawera might find help was in Rindle. As much as I didn't want to admit it, Rindle might have been his last hope. "What if it turns out they're just as bad as everyone says?" I asked. "Let's hope they prove us wrong." I took in a deep breath and exhaled it slowly. I nodded. "Let's get out of here." To Rindle, straight into the home of the people who hated us the most. That's the end of that chapter. Tune in 2 days' time for the next one. Bye.